So, hello, everyone. This is the first of our webinars for the Center for Biomodular Multiscale Systems for Precision Medicine, which is a biotechnology resource center that's funded by the National Institutes of Health. And it's a conjoined effort between people at Louisiana State University, Wake Forest School of Medicine, and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and University of Kansas. And today we're going to have a seminar given by Dr. Matt Hupert from Biofluidica. And he's going to talk to us today about rapid prototyping of microfluidics using high precision micromilling and 3D printing. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt and let him begin his presentation. The presentation will be about 45 minutes or so, and that'll leave time for questions at the end. So, Matt, please go right ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. As Steve mentioned, I work for Biofluidica, but to give you a little bit of background, my scientific career was predominantly bound to Steve Soper lab, and Biofluidica also came out of the Steve Soper laboratory. So a lot of data, past data on micromilling, you will see, was accomplished using Steve's lab. And right now, Biofluidica is commercializing some of the ideas, and you will see one example of how we use those rapid prototyping techniques in commercial development of our products. So let's start. If you look at different manufacturing technique, and it's not only for microfabrication, but pretty much any fabrication technique, you can split them in two different groups. One would be subtractive manufacturing, or so-called top-down approach, when you start with the big piece of material and with some kind of machining, milling, cutting method, you're shaping this raw piece of material into your 3D object. And these techniques may include, as I mentioned, traditional machining, laser machining, on more micro scale, wet and dry etching, focus ion beam milling, and lithography. And the other approach is additive manufacturing and so-called bottom-up approach. So you start with some kind of unorganized pile of the material, let's put it this way, and using additive manufacturing, you're assembling those pieces of the material into your 3D object. And here, right now, the most popular method fitting into this description is 3D printing, but on more micro scale, any type of deposition technique, for example, vapor deposition or sputtering of metals, fits into this description. Electroplating, right? We're starting with the ions in solution and end up with the solid object. And lithography, interestingly, fits into this description as well. So let's start with the first type of the methods, and out of this one, the one that we've most commonly used in the lab is high precision CNC micromilling. And now, just to give you a quick idea why I'm talking about specifically about the micromilling, rather some other rapid prototyping technique, like, for example, PDMS casting. And this comes from the fact that we're mostly interested in using thermoplasting for making our microfluidic devices. And this comes from a few different benefits of those. It's one major one is that these can be mass produced through injection molding. They also use low-cost substrate material, either as a form of bulk polymer material or preformed polymer shapes. It's pretty much unlimited form factor, so you can shape it to whichever size shape you would like to, of course, within the scale that's available by machining. And you can integrate both micro and macro features in the same product. You can simplify fabrication assembly. There are a number of prototyping methods, and some of them I will discuss a little bit more today. There is diverse array of material chemistries. So we can choose plastic that is good because of its optical properties or its electrical properties, or it's biocompatible. All depends on our application. We'll probably be able to find thermoplastic that fits the specific application. And we can also easily modify the surface so you can use it in different assays. Now, from the product development point of view, it's very important that we do not start prototyping in the material that's completely different than our final product. And if we look at the microfluidic device development, for example, you would have idea, then we transfer the idea into the design. We may do some computational optimization of this design and redesign it based on the input from our computational models. Then we develop some kind of prototype. We fabricate it, we test it, right? And if it says, okay, doesn't work the way we would like, we go back to the design and repeat this cycle, right? And then once we're happy with the prototype, we validate the assay works on this prototype, and we lock in the design and transfer the design to mass production. And at this specific point, the last thing you would like to do is realize at the mass production step that, wow, something doesn't work because of the manufacturing. We have to go back to the design and start the cycle again, right? And if we're successful, we end up with commercialization. So if we look, quick review of different type of prototyping techniques that you could use to develop your microfluidics. And I listed just few as a thermoplastic with replication, thermoplastic that's direct written with CNC milling, direct laser milling, very popular PDMS soft lithography, or developing the devices in glass, right? So if our final product is what we want to have in the end is a thermoplastic product, we really want to mimic in our production and design, our whole R&D processes, how our final product will be made. And if we use thermoplastics with replication, it fits all those 5 criteria that we see here. If we use, for example, direct milling, we have some issues with optical properties or geometry, similar with the thermoplastic laser milling. Our surface chemical composition may be different. Now, if we try to develop our devices in PDMS first with the idea that later we'll move it in thermoplastics, you can see how many parameters may be completely out of reach when we try to directly transfer those designs. The similar thing is with glass, right? So it is really important that and from the beginning of the product development, we choose the prototyping group that's the closest to what we want to do in the end, right? And that we understand the material properties early and really understand requirements and limitations in the following steps. So now let's go back to micromilling and how we use it in development of the thermoplastic microfluidic devices. First of all, how does the CNC milling work? It's as I mentioned, subtractive technique when we're using the mechanical tool, so-called milling bit or end mills, or some people call it simply a cutter, to shape a piece of the material by removing excess of it, right? And let's see a real quick movie of how we can make directly mill, for example, channels into piece of plastic. To do it, we're using CNC milling machine, and milling bits can be in various sizes and starting in multiple centimeters in diameter down to one that you see here, 50 micrometers. And there are also milling bits available down to about 10 micrometers in size. So how does from the user standpoint, how does the process look like? We start with our design and CAD software. We do post-processing. So we transfer our CAD design into CAM design, which basically we assign what tools we would like to use to mill our structures, how deep those structures will have to be. So this is the language that's understandable by our CNC machine, right? Then we set up the milling machine, put the right milling bit and spindle, and we load our substrate, do the CNC milling, and we get our milling part. And after we put the cover on the channels, we can have this functional microfluidic system, right? If we would like to make more of the parts, we simply repeat those steps of CNC milling and substrate load and CNC milling and make as many parts we would like to. Just to give you an idea, again, what type of milling bits we're looking at. So this is the set of SEM pictures of different size milling bits. And for comparison is a SEM of hair, of my hair, actually. What I've seen in previous pictures, there was the desktop type of milling machine, but we can also make, what we have available at KU and Physics Machine Shop is really high precision, high accuracy, fast milling machine made by Kern with 0.5 micrometer positioning accuracy, which in reality on the workpiece, it's about 2 micrometer positioning, fast spindle for 50,000 RPM. This specific machine can machine with tools down to 25 micrometers. We can also machine in multiple axes with proper attachments. Relatively large work stage to make parts up to 30 by 30 by 25 centimeters. Automatic tool changer, and this machine is capable with proper tooling, milling in metal, ceramics, and plastics, and we can make microstructures with 10:1 aspect ratio. Now, and I alluded a little bit to those two different methods, how we can use milling and making microfluidic devices. I alluded to them later, but let's just review them quickly. Again, we can use two different modes. One is direct write. So we take the piece of plastic and small milling bit and machine directly into the plastic to make our structures. Or the other method is replication. So we can take a piece of metal, for example, machine the image of our structures that we want, then replicate it by hot embossing, which is simply pushing this microstructures metal into the piece of plastic. And once we separate, we get our molded chip that has exact replica of the metal parts that we made using milling. Few things we need to consider when we think about using micromilling for microfluidic fabrication. And one thing is, when we're machining with micromilling bit, this bit has finite size, right? So for example, bit with 25 micrometers will be able to make a groove. The smallest groove will be 25 micrometers, right? What's also very important is aspect ratio of the milling bit. And if you see here, typical aspect is 3:1, especially for those small bits, which means that the deepest we can cut for the specific bit is 3 times the diameter of this bit, right? And that has very specific implications, what kind of structures we can achieve. So, for example, if you're thinking about the direct milling, as I mentioned, the smallest width of the channel will be limited by the diameter of the milling bit, but at the same time, the depth will be limited by aspect ratio, right? So if we take 100 micrometer milling bit, the narrowest channel we'll be able to make is 100 micrometers, give or take, but the depth will be 300 micrometers, right? But at the same time, we can position the channels, the spacing between channels, it's really dependent on type of material we're using, right? Whether this really tiny wall is not going to collapse and we can make a final device out of it. And on the other hand, if we're using the second approach, when we first manufacture the molding master and then replicate it in the plastic, the structures, limits on structures are a little bit different, because at this time we're limited, the spacing between structures is limited by the size of our bit. But at the same time, the structures of the replication can be much narrower than in direct writing. So they're not really limited by the bit size. And I'll show you some pictures in a minute. The other limit is that the cutting tool is round, right? So it cuts round. If you try to cut the round corner, the diameter of this round corner will be the smallest diameter that you could cut will be the same as a diameter of your milling bit. So let's say you would like to cut this cross pattern. You're milling your metal master with the 200 micrometer milling bit. Then you will have this curvature, right? So your ideal geometry will be those really sharp right angles, but you will still have some rounding just because of the milling bit geometry, right? And of course, you can minimize it by using smaller bits. And also, if you're using larger channels, the appearance of this curvature may be completely different, right? And here we can see in those two pictures below that if you cut 50 micrometer channel, you can see how badly this 400 micrometer bit would look like. But if you try to cut 400 micrometer channel, I mean, that would be much less pronounced. The other factor to consider is that milling bits are mechanical tools, so there is some sharpness, some roughness on the cutting edge related to them, and this roughness will transfer into the machined part, right? And we can see this is a wall in brass, a side wall of the raised structure in brass cut with the micro milling bit, and you see the lengthwise the wall. You can see the transfer of the roughness of the bit itself. And if you do try to measure roughness in different parts of the milled brass, for example, you will see that depending where on the structure you're measuring, it may be as low as just few nanometers roughness to as high as few hundred nanometer roughness if you measure it top to bottom on the sidewall. And just to give you a few examples how we're using it in real life. And this is a gallery of microstructures milled in brass. SCM, so microstructures, top one milled in brass. And you can see how here we can machine very high aspect ratio structures with only 20 micrometers wide and which are 400 micrometer high. And it came from the fact that we actually machined everything around it, right? So only these structures were left. So we can push the limits of what size structures can be made with micromilling by using this replication route. The other example here is molded. These are micro posts molded from the machined brass insert. We can make the designs that have different heights on the same mold. For example, if you try to do it with lithography, you would have to do two-step lithography versus in micromilling, it's all done in a single step. And if you emboss these channels and then do into the plastic, put the cover plate on it and do the cut it through, you can see how channels can have different geometry, I mean, different height on the same, from the same mold. Another common way we're using micromilling in the lab, in this specific example show direct write, and for example, we can do chip-to-chip interconnect, so we can machine those conical ports and the substrate that then was using the semi-rigid moldable tube. By pressing it together, we can connect two chips together or connect chip to a motherboard. And these have very low dead volume, provide automatic chip alignment, and have really high pressure tolerance. The other way is to make the on-chip valves. This is a combination lamination of different materials. So you will have a bottom chip fluidic layer, and then we may have the pneumatic layer on the top with some elastomeric or thermoplastic elastomer on the top. And as we apply vacuum, we pull this elastomer, opening the path for the, sorry about that, for the fluid flow, or we apply pressure, we're closing the valve. And this is the top view of one of those valves machined directly in plastic. The other example is for example, the array chip with integrated waveguide and light coupling prism. This is a very nice example to show that you can not only make a structure by micromilling structures that are different heights, but also that have different geometry, and everything is done in the same pretty much piece, in the same machining step, in the same piece of brass, and then transferred to the plastic. And this was the example where we used the chip with the integrated waveguide for evanescent field excitation. So when we shoot the laser through the side prism, so you can see this wall is slanted, it's not vertical, we can achieve by total internal reflection, we can just excite the microarray probe on the surface of this chip. And here you can see the results of the microarray readout from this specific chip. We can also think, so I gave you the reason why we're interested mostly in this technique, because we're using thermoplastic, but you can actually use this and use micromill to make tools that let you fabricate devices by other techniques, like for example, by casting PDMS. So we can make, we can use milling to make tools for PDMS casting. And that was, we showed the application as for patterning of DNA arrays, when we would take the PDMS device, lay it on the UV modified PMMA, first run through those channels different oligonucleotide probes, and then by putting our cast device perpendicular, we could read different samples in the microarray format. And the way we've done it was that we first micromill the mold, out of which we replicated the PMMA casting tool, right? And you can see again, the same tool has both micro and macro structures, and we were able to cast PDMS out of this to pattern arrays. And I believe back then the best we could do was spots, about 250 micrometer spots with 250 micrometer spacing. And using this type of casting tool has a huge advantage over the regular route when it's done in the lab, where you lithography pattern SU8 resin on the silicon wafers. And one thing is that you can, from the single brass tool, you can make multiple replicates in the PMMA, right? So we can set up ourselves with multiple casting tools, so our production process is much higher, it's much faster, right? We're not dealing with multiple wafers, making multiple wafers via lithography on SU8 on silicon. We'll just do a couple more embossing steps and we have our tools, right? These are pretty much unbreakable and they can be easily replaced. Since PMMA is hydrophobic by nature, the PDMS doesn't really stick, so you can use them over and over again without worrying that something sticks to the surface. And as shown on this SCM, we can do multiple heights, which means, and multiple size ranges, which means we can do also those posts that after you cut your PDMS become holes. So instead of having a flat piece of PDMS that you have to punch, in this case, 32 holes, this gives you pretty much ready to use PDMS device. Another application where it, just to show, this is really good example because it shows how you can use this technique to actually prototype your microfluidic network before you move on to some more sophisticated way of making your device, right? And this is, in this example, we've made the nucleic acid extraction device in microtiter plate format, so 96 well, addressed by 2 ports. And first question was, okay, will this idea even work, that we can uniformly address all 96 well just using these 2 ports? And we started with the brass master that was micro-milled, right? Because of the size limitation of the milling bits, we were only able to make about 76 posts in each reactor for extraction, 76 posts with 100 micrometer diameter. And really, to making this plate, to 2 major fabrication steps. One was to make the plate itself, and the second is to mill those microstructures on it. So pretty much 1 person, 1 machine. It took 5 days from the design delivered to the machinists to get hot embossed fluidic chips. And now those 5 days, really 2 days it took only was this whole milling of those little holes, right? Because it's all done serially. So once we were able to prove, yes, this works, microfluidic works just fine, we decided to develop the nickel hot embossing tool using UV Liga, and you can see the difference, right? Because via lithography, we could make much smaller posts with diameter 10. We could put 15,000 on those posts within this bed, right? So the whole patterning and the lithography step, it is way faster than if you think about milling anything like this, right? Because it happens in the 1 exposure time, right? And we have much higher resolution. Everything is better. Well, the only thing is that really, if you count major fabrication steps, it is about 8 major steps. It took 3 people and 7 pieces of different equipment to deliver this nickel mold. It's about 6 weeks, and 6 weeks is fast in this case, right? To organize everything, that everything works just as it needs. But it shows, I think this is the perfect example how using micromilling you can prototype certain aspects of your design to get to commit to more complicated way of production. And just to give you another example how we used it in commercial development of biofluidica CTC isolation chip. We followed exactly the same ideas. So we started with the brass master, hot embossed plate with 4 devices that then we had to cut out. And here are some SCM to show a really nice quality of this milled master and replication. And after we were happy with what we developed, we moved it to mass production through injection molding. And you can see the whole array. You can see how quick it is and how high, and that you can make them in the high throughput. But we use the same ideas pretty much, not only to design the microfluidic themselves, but also to do the work to chip interface for those chips. So we were really interested in putting our chips on the robotic platform. So instead of having syringe pump that through some kind of glued and tubing pushes the sample and reagent through, we wanted to address the chip through the pipetting robot. And we checked different. One of the designs that we went through had the directly milled ports to accommodate pipettes. Then we actually moved to the milled cover in the shape of this molded chip with 3D printed little ports. And finally, once we were happy with the design, we designed the cover plate that has molded in ports. And you can see here an example of the robot in action with 8 chips addressed simultaneously by 16 pipettes. So in summary, a few attributes of high precision milling: it's fast and expensive, lets you do rapid prototyping, high aspect ratios, more than 10, vertical walls, you can do 2D and 3D components with multi-levels, and some limitations are mostly related to the roughness of the walls, the rounded inner corners, and limits by the tooling used to machine channels, with the feature dimensions higher than 5 microns for replication route and 25 for direct write, and inner feature spacing in the reversed order, 25 for replication and more than 5 for direct write. So let's move to the second subject of this presentation. And I have to make a disclaimer: I don't have as much experience with 3D printing as with the using milling for microfluidic applications, so it's a little bit of the review. So 3D printing, if you you can find the definition online that says it's an additive manufacturing process that creates a physical object from a digital design. And as you can see in this definition, there is no mention that you're using some kind of substrate, right? It only says, oh, you have a design, you press a button and you get your object. And with the current technology development and 3D printing, that very often is true, right? If your machine is preloaded, the only thing you do, preloaded with your substrate material, the only thing you do, you press the button and get your design. It's not really as true if you want to push the limits, what you can do for microfluidics, and I will discuss it a little bit later. So what can 3D printing do? And you can really 3D print structures from meters down to nanometers. And as examples, you can see this concrete house in Germany, 3D printed from ground up, down to this little castle and the tip of the pencil that was 3D printed using 2-photon polymerization technique. With, as you can see, those tiny columns are in the sub-nanometer range, right? And we can really 3D print everything in between. And we're talking about the construction. An example is this bridge in Netherlands. You can print the hypercars, what they call now, with pretty much including metal components, including plastic panels. Most of it can be 3D printed. Recently, the SpaceX showed their newest Raptor 3 engine And you can see that it is 7% lighter with 21% more thrust, and you can see how much less complicated it is comparing to the earlier designs of the same engine. And it's all done because 3D printed was used at certain steps. You can use it for sports equipment, for example, these shoes from Adidas, or in healthcare, different ways, and you can use it as a hobbyist. And applications are really limitless, right? So the question is how one technique can produce so many different things, right? And the truth is that there are really many different technologies that fall under the single name of 3D printing, right? And just to run a summary of different methods, the most popular probably is fused deposition modeling, where the thermoplastic polymer is extruded and layered on the flat surface and built layer by layer. And you can look at this movie on the right that kind of shows the process. There is a stereolithography, where instead of thermoplastics, we use photosensitive resins and we use lasers to shape our devices. PolyJet uses, again, photosensitive resins. It allows for multicolor printing. Powder bed fusion, this technique can produce polymer metal ceramic structures, and we have different subcategories like selective laser sintering, where we're using laser light to fuse together little particles for polymers or ceramics. Direct metal laser sintering, similar electron beam melting, or multi-jet fusion, which is comparable to the actually regular laser printing. And you can, in this technique, you can make different color prints in the single run. Wire additive manufacturing, this is how this example of this bridge I showed you was made. And bioprinting, where you can make hydrogels, cells, etc. I'm going to what are the main attributes of 3D printing, right? And you can tell, oh, it's simplicity, because you just press the button and your design becomes reality, right? And in many cases, it's true. So it's very straightforward to the user. Very often, no prior experience is required. So you literally start with the design and print, right? You can make what I call impossible parts. So for example, this is a great example of this ball inside a ball inside a ball that was 3D printed. And if you try to do it by traditional machining, you would have to run multiple half balls that then you have to assemble, versus you could machine something like this by 3D printing in the one step. You can use the same printer to make different size parts. It's very fast prototyping. You can do small batch production even. It's faster than conventional machining in many cases. Nowadays, there is a wide selection of the materials with different physical properties, from hard polymers, elastomers, metal ceramics to biopolymers. And what's really interesting is everybody is still very excited about 3D printing, because it is relatively young manufacturing field. So there's a lot of research going on that improves selection of material. You get better quality of the parts, speeds and cost. And a few examples here. The example on the right is that you could, for example, in the more microfluidic way, you could make a design that's complete pretty much in the single run. So it was a design for isolation of particles, I believe, on this little bed inside. But what's important here is that not only you could do those reactors, right, you could also add the macro features to accommodate your connectors, right? Instead of doing it multiple steps by machining, you could just do it, right? to quick comparison of different 3D techniques. And I'm gonna only talk today about stereolithography pretty quickly, because this is the one that gives you the best results really in microfluidics. This is the oldest 3D printing technique, conceptualized and demonstrated in the early 80s. It was patented, and the 80s, the first commercial system was available on the market. And its importance in the manufacturing field is such that it was first SLA1, it was the first 3D printing machine by 3D Systems, was declared the historic mechanical engineering landmark by American Society of Mechanical Engineering. And the way this machine worked is that we have a vat filled with photosensitive resin, and we're scanning a laser through the resin, and step by step, layer by layer, we're building our 3D object. There were numerous improvements over the years for the SLA instrumentation, mostly in using digital masks for layer by layer projections. So instead of running the laser point by point, we can actually display the entire image, similar like we would do this in lithography, for example. Display entire image, and as we're moving our part out of this resin, we're displaying the array of the images different for any specific layer, and this way building our 3D structures that really improve the speed and reduce the cost. The lasers over the years were substituted by less expensive light sources, mostly high power UV lamps and LED arrays, and that led really to the democratization of SLA. So you can go on Amazon and buy yourself a 3D printer, SLA type, for down to $300, right? Where original 3D printer from 3D System in length of 80s cost $250,000 in 1980s money, right? So it gives you the idea how far the field moved. An important context as far as the microfabrication in 3D printing is so-called voxel, and voxel is really pixel in 3D, right? So it's the smallest volumetric element that we can produce, right? And in SLA, it's dependent on the laser spot size or digital mask pixel size resolution, step resolution in the Z, so how quickly we build this, or what resolution we get that we move between different masks, different layers, and as well as processing conditions and resin composition. And just to give you example of this, how complicated you can make those devices, from the literature, this was the using commercial 3D printer with DLP method. You can see how this entire design with all the ports for syringes or the ports for fluidic connections for multiple layers, right, and the design was done in the single machining, single 3D printers run. You can look at this if we were trying to do it, let's say, direct milling with assembly, or we would have to use many layers and many assembly steps. What's actually interesting, though, is that one of the groups did survey of the commercial 3D printers, and what they noticed that even if the 3D printer manufacturers say that, let's say, our Z resolution is only 25 micrometers, or our spot of the laser side is, let's say, 25, which would make the voxel size 25 by 25 by 25 micrometers, that's in reality, that's never true, right? So they run the survey of different commercial printers and shown the instrumental resolution does not represent well, practically achievable resolution, and that the commercial printers allowed at best to print with sub-millimeter, maybe down to 100 micrometer square size resolution channels, right? So this is a significant limitation if you want to go well below that. And I mentioned earlier that it's so simple to use 3D printer. However, if you really want to push the limits of the research, you have to spend a lot of time improving, and both on the instrumentation side and on the chemistry side, using different photoinitiator and different custom resin formulations. And this is example from Professor Woolley lab, when they built their own printer with the voxel size down to 7x7, roughly 8x8x5 micrometers, and by optimizing different resin formulations, they were able to actually push the limits and make the channels down to the 20x20 micrometer cross section. And as well, what's very interesting when we're talking, for example, milling aspect ratio of the channels 10:1, and we say, oh yeah, it's great, right? It's very high aspect ratio. With this technique that they developed, you can make aspect ratio more than 130, right? So that gives things also in the perspective. And one last slide, really quick, since I'm reaching my 45-minute time limit, is the stereolithography and nanometer regime, as shown in this initial, when I showed you earlier on this little castle on the tip of the pencil. This is a technique that basically takes advantage of the advanced optics and process so-called multi-photon absorption, or in two-photon absorption. Two-photon absorption, it's basically an that electronic transition in the material, so in this photoresist, is driven not by a single photon, but two photons or more in combination, right? And it shows here on this picture that if you just run through the UV lamp, the beam from the microscope objective through the solution of rhodamine B, you can see how wide this beam is in the rhodamine. So how much of this rhodamine B is excited to give up the fluorescence, right? Versus if you run it with titanium sapphire laser at 800 nanometers in this two-photon mode, you can see that this really, really tiny area and this tip is excited. And this gives this tremendous resolution that you can get with stereolithography. And you can see, as you can see, the voxel size can go down to 100 nanometers to 500 nanometers in lateral. It's a little bit bigger in the z-axis with 100 to 1.4 micrometer, and you can achieve really low roughness. And the few other examples were interesting, other than castles, right, on the tip of the pencil. These are both, one is from UpNano and from Nanoscribe. You can see this is the spinner. So it's a three-dimensional microstructure built within the already produced fluidic channels, right? So you can see how complicated it can get. In case it's not well visible, this little bar here, it's 50 micrometers, right? And the other example is 3D mixer, again, overlaid within the little microfluidic channels. And one limitation of this technique is that, yes, we can, add very complicated, very tiny components, but it is rather slow technique. So right now it's more of a curiosity rather than really mass production tool. And with that, I would like to conclude. And if you have any question, please feel free to ask.
Hey, thank you, Matt. If you want to ask questions, there's one or two ways to do that. You can put it in the chat box and then I can read it, or Matt can just read it to the audience, or you can just go ahead and speak up. You can unmute yourself and then ask a question. So the floor is open for any questions you might have.
Hi, Matt. I have a question.
Yep.
Go ahead, Katie.
So from what I saw, a lot of your slides on the 3D printing were on the different ways people are developing different ways to do 3D printing, but have you come across any companies specifically in the microfluidic space that have commercialized 3D printed microfluidics?
Not really.
Why do you think that is?
And I think the major reason would be that it is, I would call it, it's larger size microfluidics in a sense. So you really have to push the limit to get below this 100 micrometer range, right? And it is also, when you start doing something much smaller, it becomes slower. So 3D printing is sometimes it's considered to be really competitive to mass producing through injection molding when you're doing small batches. But I think when you get to microfluidic range, it just becomes too slow. And the last point would be that you really you also have to consider you have limited number of materials, right? Like, for example, this example from Adam Presul-Woolley lab shows is you really have to optimize it to push the limits, and that limits the number of materials that you can really use, right, to this specific resin formulation, which doesn't necessarily have to work for you for your application.
Thank you.
Hello, Matt.
Hey, Farhad. How are you?
Good. Very informative. Thank you. So, Matt, actually following Katie's question, I mean, like for microfluidics, based on my experience, I think also microfluidics, when we use 3D printing to make microfluidic chip, it's not reproducible. Do you see that one as basically that challenge as well? Like not reproducible, basically.
So I think it's the reproducibility is proportionally dependent how much time you spend to make it reproducible, right? So this is the big advantage of 3D printing is that if you have one at university in your lab, in many cases it is, oh, I need to make a part, right? I design it, I go run the machine, it's done. But it doesn't mean that it will be exactly the same the next time around, especially in the micrometer regime. And the reason may be that it's all done by using the protocols developed by the printer manufacturer, right? You have a limit what you can really do and how much you can typically adjust the process just using commercial printers, right? Typically, it's just Z level resolution, or you have three choices: high resolution, low resolution, and medium, something like this, right? So I think you cannot. These are not tools designed specifically for making microfluidics. They're more designed to make more millimeters are structures, I would say, right? So that way, this lack of reproducibility may come from.
Got it. Yep. Thank you,
Matt.
Yes.
On that note, I think people do use, and I like you to comment, and you kind of presented this. You could use 3D printer as a master to fabricate more reproducibly devices, right? There is I forget now, there's a company that creates 3D printed molds for PDMS casting, or actually CBM² collaborator, Dr. Martin, I think he used metal mold to do 3D printing. Can you comment on that?
So I would say that yes, you can. 3D printing, I think, is still very valuable in any product development. It just has limits right now in the micrometer size regime, right? And when we're saying about, for example, yes, some of those companies that we've seen here I showed for this 2-photon polymerization, they offer services that they can make you a master that you can then electroplate to make the molding tool to replicate your devices, right? So as much as this kind of alleviate the issue of this being really slow, photon polymerization being really slow, because you end up with nickel master that then you can replicate quickly and at low cost. In a way, it becomes a regular tool, right? We're just using tool we're just making a tool to fabricate. So we're using 2-photon polymerization to fabricate a tool that then we can mass produce through injection molding, right? So it puts this technique at the par, let's say, of usability as micromilling metal masters, right? Because it does not really fully deliver on the promise of 3D printing that you get your final product with it, right? And it is, by all means, this is a very important application, and it's very useful. It's just, in a sense, it's not true 3D printing, right? And as far as the other question, yes, I believe Professor Martin group uses I think they use multi-jet printing, if I'm not mistaken, and they used it. So what they took, they used the metal masters with micromilled structures and then 3D print around it. So by using this hybrid technique, they can make devices that microstructures are defined by high resolution metal masters, but at the same time they can manufacture all different macro components, taking full advantage of 3D printing, right? So it's a good example of how the technique can be used in the fabrication pipeline.
Thank you. Thanks.
We have time for one more question. Is there any other questions from the audience? So Matt, just a brief question. So you have tabletop CNC mills versus this high precision micro mill. So what is the big differences between those two? I know one is smaller feature sizes, but what other things are common to those two types of machines? Because the high precision mill is an awfully big machine.
So the biggest difference that if you look at this, I think it's if you look at this desktop CNC milling machine, by the just of course the biggest difference is cost, right? The Karen is right now probably about $300,000. The desktop milling machine is $2,000, right? From the practical standpoint in microfluidic, the way we were using it in the lab, for example, for direct milling, you can definitely do smaller structures with current because it gives higher stability of the entire machine. The milling bit itself has less less, you can spin it faster, so you can cut with smaller bits, right? You can, this is highly stable, so you don't have, your channels are really the size of the bit that you're using. The milling of this $2,000 desktop machine, the smallest features I made are about 150 micrometers and very limited area, versus we can cut on the kern, we can cut metals down to 50 micrometers reproducibly, and then day in, day out. And with 200 micrometer bit, because this machine is so stable, doesn't break the bits in the process, you can machine pretty much the entire brass, like 3-inch brass insert with the features that are, for example, 50 micrometers deep, right? So to start the research, if somebody is interested, I would say definitely get this cheaper desktop machine, because you can do a lot. If you're talking about the 200 micrometer size channels and different shape structures, you can, in direct milling and plastics, you can achieve a lot. If you want to make high precision embossing masters, definitely you need some better machine that can reproducibly machine brass and can do it quickly.
Okay, so thanks everyone for participating. Our center will have another webinar in October, and we will be sending out flyers on that. So with that, I want to thank Matt, and I'm going to thank everyone for their participation. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.